You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to On the Way Home. I'm Emmy Kelly from Blue Door, and at Blue Door, we have some very exciting things going on. But most of all, the reason that we serve every day is to be here in the community and support individuals to reach their goals. Today, I'm joined by some amazing guests. We have a panel. We have John Fox, who's a housing and development lawyer with a rich history in housing. We have Diana Chan McNally, who's the communications and community engagement specialist. And we have Camille Quenneville from CMHA Ontario. She's the CEO there, and we are very grateful for them investing this time to discuss Bill 6 and Bill 10. And we hope that it'll be an intriguing conversation for our listeners. Certainly, we're going to learn a lot more about these bills and how they will impact the sector and what we can do to get involved or to spread the word or to educate ourselves on it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, John, Diana, and Camille. Thanks so much for joining us on the way home today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
We're going to start out with our signature question. To start the episode, we always ask our guests, what does home mean to you? So we'll start with Camille, and then John, and then Diana.
Well, I think home for me is every bit as much a feeling as it is an actual location. For me personally, I was actually born and raised in Windsor, and when I'm there, I feel like I'm quote unquote home. But I had a really interesting conversation the other day with a furniture manufacturer, and we were talking about housing, and in its broadest form, of course. And it was the kind of conversation where we talked about it in the context of one can have a home or literally a roof over one's head, but you're not really home unless you're part of a community or part of something broader, and that you feel comfortable and safe in that place that you consider home. So very much a feeling and very much a place where we really just want to be ourselves and be with those we love.
Well, this is my, it's not the first time I've gotten to answer this question on this podcast. I don't know if I'm consistent or not, but for me, it's the feeling of comfort that I get when I'm on my street in my house. I get to recover from the day, be with my family, and prepare for the next. And I get to be there with a feeling of safety and security. And that is a good home feeling for me.
I also have answered this question before, and I have no idea what I answered in the past, but I think for me, it is not a brick and mortar structure. It is, as Camille said, a sense of community and belonging. So the people that you're with, the people that you love, no matter where you are physically, I think a sense of home will always arise as long as you have those deep connections and relationships with people. I'm also somebody who kind of has a very amorphous background. I don't know about the white side of my family very much. The Chinese side of my family, I have no connection to that history either. And so for me to be connected to a land or a nationality and an ethnicity, these things don't really mean as much to me as relationships do, again. So that kind of chosen family is really where I feel at home.
There's a chosen family on your lap.
I know. She's gonna disrupt a bunch.
Well, I'm hoping that before we dive into the subject matter today, that each of you could introduce yourselves, share a little bit more about your background and the work you do in housing and the community sector. We'll start with you, Camille.
Thanks, Emmy. I'm CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division, and CMHA is actually Canada's oldest nationwide health charity, something that we hold dear, those of us who work in this organization. My colleagues across the province who run our branches, there are 27 branches covering the province. They are, I can say this without bias, they are exceptional leaders in providing services within those communities. A number of services, including crisis intervention, housing and supports, case management, substance use support, all kinds of things that you might imagine for community-based mental health and addictions providers. And, we are really very focused on a journey of continual quality improvement in all that we do, and really for the benefit of those we serve.
Diana?
I often get asked this question. I often don't know how to respond. I consider myself a schemer, which is to say that I'm often scheming ways that we can fight back against policies at all different levels, using the resources that we have, using the communities, not using them, but engaging our communities in fighting back against the things that we know that cause homelessness, for example. So I'm a schemer, but I'm also a fellow with Maytree, the Maytree Foundation. I worked frontline for 11 years and still continue to maintain a strong connection to the frontline because that's personally where I feel the most at home. So scheming.
Awesome. John?
So I started in housing as general counsel for development at Toronto Community Housing. I was there for 7 years or so, the last 2 as its VP of development. So I was directly involved in the Regent Park revitalization and a series of other TCH initiatives. And when I came back into private law practice, I stayed with housing. So I continued to be a part of nonprofit providers, some co-ops, sector organizations, and so on. I get to be involved in some sort of policy building at the Ontario and national levels when I get lucky. And Emmy, of course, one of my favorite things is that I am also a volunteer on the Blue Door Champions Circle in York Region and on the Dixon Hall Real Estate Committee right here in downtown Toronto.
And thank you, John. Thank you all for everything that you do. And thank you, John, also for volunteering with us. It is so helpful. You bring such a wealth of expertise to the table. Since we are chatting with you, John, I'm wondering if you could start us off to break down what Bill 10 is, what's new here, what are the legal implications for landlords and housing providers?
Well, that's a big question. So I'm going to try and stick with sort of as technical an answer as I can for starters, just to set the tone here. So first of all, Bill 10 has amends a series of bills, and what we're actually going to talk about is one new piece of legislation which is inside that bill called Measures Respecting Premises with Illegal Drug Activity Act 2025. The intent of the bill, if I can, I read through the Hansard extract from the speeches that introduced the bill, and the minister was speaking, and I'm going to do a little bit of reading in this particular answer just to make sure I get this right, and I'm also going to read a little bit from the act. It's not very long. He said, we're also, in talking about the bills, and we're also going to hold landlords accountable for knowingly permitting the manufacture or sale of illicit drugs. And later in his speech went on to say that if you're renting a facility, and speaking to landlords there, knowingly to somebody that is contravening the laws and engaging in manufacturing, as an example, illegal drugs, or carrying on in such a way, you too have to be held to account. And largely that is what the bill ostensibly is attempting to do. It has 2 main direct provisions which lay that down, which I'm going to read. One is Section 2, which says, no person shall knowingly permit a premises of which the person is a landlord to be used in relation to a prescribed offense. 2 little comments on that. Landlord is broad, so if you're subletting, you're in. If you're a commercial landlord, you're in, and you can continue to listen to the show knowing this involves you. And secondly, there is a defense to that, which is if you as a defendant, as a landlord defendant, took reasonable measures to prevent the activity. We'll get back to reasonable measures later on in this podcast, I'm sure. And the second offense is no person shall knowingly possess the proceeds of an offense under this act. Now, a couple of things to be careful of. This act has received royal assent. It is not enforced today. No doubt because there's a fair amount of feedback similar to what you're going to hear on the balance of this show. And the fact that if you're a prescribed offense here means that you are knowingly permitting a prescribed offense under another act. In this case, Controlled Substances Act or the Cannabis Act or whatever they prescribe. It's not the same thing as being guilty of that offense. So if somebody is trafficking drugs in a unit, that is a criminal offense in and of itself. You as a landlord, if you knowingly permit this, will be guilty of an offense under this act with ramifications to your organization and its directorship and officership.
Wow. So Camille, then, from a systems and leadership perspective, how does this legislation intersect with the realities of mental health and addiction services in housing? Are we setting up housing providers to succeed or to fail?
Well, that's a great question. I'll just first say that John did a stellar job giving a précis of this legislation, which I think is really very helpful. It's probably fair to say it's early days in terms of really understanding how this will work on the ground. We don't have the guidelines or regulations as yet, and as you might guess, given the work that we do, we will be tracking that and anxiously awaiting to see what that might look like. Our organization has over 6,000 supportive housing or housing units across Ontario, and as you might guess, that means we work with a large number of landlords and others in both transitional and supportive housing roles. Our goal is to expand that. Obviously, there's a very deep need across the province in every part of the province, without question. And what is not helpful is having any impediment to being able to work with landlords, to being able to secure additional space, to be able to house people in need. So our hope and our advocacy is going to really center around ensuring that this does not become problematic for my colleagues who are always looking to secure additional space. It's hard enough financially. We really don't need any other barriers. There are far too many people, as we all know, that are currently homeless, and quite honestly, the vast majority of those, more than 70%, have a mental health issue or have mental illness. And I think at the end of the day, those are people that need our support, and we need to be able to find our way forward in terms of getting them appropriate housing.
Diana, you mentioned that your happy career place is on the front lines and you've worked directly with tenants in crisis. How do you think this law will impact the relationship between tenants and housing staff, especially in buildings where harm reduction is part of the support model?
I mean, I think in this case, we have legislation that is at odds with the mandate of supportive housing, especially for folks who use drugs. And I think what John and Camille have mentioned is that we don't have parameters within this law that we understand exactly what the application, the intended application is meant to be. I can only kind of start to suggest what some of the possibilities could be. But I think, John mentioned that there are ramifications, not just for landlords, but for boards, for directorship, but also for frontline staff. So within this act as well, they can be seen as abetting drug trafficking if they don't take reasonable measures to stop it. And there is we don't have any sense of what reasonable measures look like. Is this constant surveillance? I certainly hope not, but there again are no guidelines as to what that actually means within the scope of this law. I worry because we've seen in other cases, in Leslieville, for example, that we've had a frontline worker who's been charged and convicted of abetting in the death of a woman who was shot outside of a supervised consumption site. So there's a lot of scrutiny right now being paid to the front line. And if we have this kind of liability in place with our services, that is where you're going to see, I think, the bulk of the kind of control and stress being placed. So for frontline workers, what does it mean to participate or allow drug trafficking? Drug trafficking is not this giant nefarious thing. It is having 2 bags. It is having 2 pills, a couple of joints, something that you could reasonably share, and it doesn't have any prescribed quantities under the law. And again, if you have a mandate to support people who use drugs and you're at odds with that, how are you meant to engage? I can see that people will start to worry themselves about liability, start to pull back. We're going to start to see harm reduction being scaled back, even unofficially. People just not wanting to support that because they're afraid of any kind of ramifications against them. And that really worries me. I think we're going to set up this kind of situation where we've been in this in the past. I worked before we had supervised consumption sites where there are certain workers who are skirting the edges of the law because they know what's right for people, which was to say we support people who use drugs. If they're using drugs in our spaces, we are not going to throw them out because that's a safety risk. But you're also going to have other workers who, again, will follow a more hardline approach and stop drug use, stop permitting that, whatever it may look like. And I think it's going to set us up to be in a very, very weird position. We're going to be pitting ourselves against each other, and then we have the broader organizations that we're thinking about, the directorship and the boards and the leadership, and how they may also be impacted by what's going on in the front lines. So it's going to get messy, I think. Again, if we don't have any sense of what the real application of this law is, and I don't know what the future holds. I can only, start to suggest what it could look like, but I think all of us are still pretty in the dark.
John, maybe we'll come back to where you said let's speak about reasonable measures later on that landlords must take to prevent drug-related activities. Can you explain what that might look like in practice, especially for nonprofit housing providers?
It's time just to say no, because I don't know. But all we can do is speculate. Now, but think about this: all across Ontario, as people become aware of this bill who are sitting on boards, they're walking into the next board meeting, they're going, hey, Madam CEO, how are you taking reasonable measures to make sure I'm not liable in the event that one of our tenants brings 2 pills in and sells one to somebody else in the unit, right? So what are those reasonable measures? And because nobody really knows, because it hasn't come out, there is no direct answer to that, no clarity for how a landlord ought to behave. In fact, forget about how a landlord ought to behave in the grand scheme of things, just ought to behave to stay out of trouble here. So it drives you down certain paths, right? So does that mean that when we have somebody come in now to sign a lease, we're going to add in the right to inspect on a monthly basis to make sure you're not installing production? The RTA says that if there's reasonable reasons for putting in an inspection right in a lease, you can do that. This act probably creates the reasonable reason to create a right of inspection, and somebody's going to say put that in. Well, in some places maybe that's okay, but in others, for example, where you have supportive housing providers who are engaged in harm reduction, that's going to be problematic for all the reasons that Camille mentioned. Does it mean you have to put in CCTV cameras everywhere to make sure you're monitoring what's happening in the hallways? I mean, everybody gets behind the notion that landlords should not be able to turn a blind eye to activities in the building which are creating problems for neighbors and things. Like kids shouldn't be dodging lines outside somebody's apartment when they're getting home for the same reason that I think I should be safe in my home. So like there's something there. But if you are a municipal provider and you've got 58,000 units, like anything that is an expense is going to be a big deal for you. So that is also a concern. So there is a balancing of rights here, which does not appear to be here. And finally, I'd say, even if you're down the path of what a reasonable measure is, it's a pretty good bet that if you discover now that you suddenly actually know, you now know that somebody is engaged in one of these offenses, that you're now obliged to do something about it. But there's no section here that says, okay, we're going to equip the landlord and tenant board for more evidence-based evictions, or we're going to have a hearing or something like that. That's not there. So I think what's challenging for landlords is, okay, if I can't evict because I can't get to the board, and I'm not allowed to take the rent because I can't take the proceeds of what's going on, then what exactly am I supposed to do in this situation? So I'm hoping that staff team at the Ministry of the Attorney General is worrying about exactly those things. And one of the reasons that this is not enforced yet is because they know that they're going to have to lay that out on a smoother, more direct trajectory to put some of those fears to bed. And even when they do that, I don't think it's going to put to bed the fears that Diana raised earlier. It's likely to make a clearer line for landlords in that scenario.
Sounds like things could get trickier for housing providers if this goes through. Camille, how do you balance community safety with a trauma-informed, recovery-focused approach in housing settings? And what risks do you see if this legislation is enforced too rigidly?
Well, I think it's been interesting hearing both John and Diana, who have great expertise. And I'm picking up the language, John talking about we don't know, and Diana using the word messy, which I'm probably going to steal, talking about this legislation, because it is very much in need of some clarity. That might be an understatement. So let me just state from the outset, this isn't really an issue about community safety from my perspective. The province has every right to be concerned and to act to ensure that communities are safe. I'm a very big believer in advocacy. It's something that we are really is in our DNA here in terms of how we work with government. And you know, for lots of reasons, both the provincial and municipal government have many tools in their disposal around community safety. The issue really is, and I think John was alluding to this in particular, is what does that actually look like? And the question is a good one, because if we think about what if it is enacted rigidly, I'm not sure I could even define what that would look like or what that would mean in this moment. And certainly not before we have regulations or at least further comment from government. But what I can say is, you know, we do have some sense of where the public is on this based on some polling that we did last year. We were very interested as these issues were rising to the surface, and we were hearing a lot about community safety. We were very interested to hear what the public thought, and we commissioned a poll through Polera, and we asked the question, you know, are these public safety issues, are these health related issues, and I'm speaking specifically about people struggling on the street in whatever capacity that looked like. And much to our delight, to be quite honest, we learned that 81% of Ontarians believe it is in fact a health issue, and it's not an issue related to criminal justice. And that really informed a lot of our advocacy, as you might guess, and really helped us have some emphasis when we talk to government about how these approaches need to be made. So I think we could probably focus our concern in two specific areas here. So it's the service providers who ultimately have to work with landlords and ideally be able to manage that relationship where they may have concerns and how that will look different in light of this legislation. And of course, for our clients who already are faced with discrimination and stigma, you know, routinely, and wanting to ensure that that this again is not a further injustice, if you will, in terms of them being able to have appropriate housing.
John, will this impact directors, officers, and boards of nonprofit housing organizations and their interest or ability to volunteer? I know we're saying, you know, this bill isn't yet passed or enforced, but if we think about how should individuals think about serving as a volunteer while still being able to protect against personal liability?
Yeah. So when people read this this bill, everybody seems to have a different gasp moment because people react differently based on their experiences. And I have to give this one of the gasp moments for me was exposing volunteer directors to something so out of their control, and sometimes things that they're actually deliberately intending to do. So in supportive housing environments, if you were to ask me, well, if you know that some measure of trafficking in its smallest form is going on, are you liable as a director? The answer is probably yes under this provision. And so how do you protect yourself against that? From the point of view of this provision, until reasonable measures are known or some exception is made for nonprofit providers who are particularly in this specific area, the answer is you can't. You'd have to put the assets of the corporation between you and personal liability through indemnification. But you can appreciate that how a private director with larger economic assets to backstop an indemnity like that would feel more comfortable than a nonprofit who generally puts all their assets to the service of the community they're serving. So that, those are challenging places to put a director. Now, I don't really expect to see a flight from boards, but it's not because I think that this is not a big issue. It's because I think the people I've met who have served on those boards care so much that they won't leave the boards or the responsibilities that they've taken on. But I do think that they will find ways of advocating for a change which will allow for protection of board members in that way. So I do think it will be a chilling effect. I don't think people will run for the hills just yet, but I do not like the notion that volunteer directors are exposed to personal liabilities for things they cannot control like this.
That's really helpful, and it's reflective too at a time when volunteering is already, over the last 10 years been historically going down. And I think some charities and nonprofits do struggle to find volunteers to join their boards. And so it's just interesting to note that this will likely not have very many positive effects on that particular piece. Diana, you've been doing a lot of advocating as well around Bill 6. Could you please tell us a little bit about Bill 6 and how it impacts the homelessness and housing space?
Yeah, I see this as companion legislation to Schedule 8 of Bill 10, which is what we've been discussing. I think it's deliberate that these things are broken up across multiple bills. I think that is a way to deflect from our taking the government to court, essentially. And we have to do this across several bills on several instances if we are going to challenge these things. But Bill 6 is very much kind of the companion to this piece of Bill 10, because we're not talking about housing. We are talking about people without housing. So with the Safer Municipalities Act, it came up in December of 2024 as Bill 242. We had an election, died on the floor, came back as Bill 6, and was recently passed. And so in this case, the Safer Municipalities Act is ostensibly about prohibiting the consumption of illegal substances in public places. So that would include in any public park, including inside somebody's actual encampment. So again, we have reasonable grounds as kind of the framework for this without any real clarity, again, specifically about how that would apply. But if a police officer has reasonable grounds, quote unquote, to believe that someone may be using or have possession of drugs, including inside their encampment, the remedies that are in place for that, they can ask that person to move along. So essentially, we evict that encampment immediately without whatever bylaws that happen to be in place within your municipality. Sometimes we have a 2-week grace period, for example. Sometimes it's 24 hours, 48 hours. It can now be immediate. And on top of that, if somebody doesn't comply, they don't hand over their drugs, or they just don't want to leave where they are, we can arrest somebody without a warrant. We can put them in jail for up to 6 months. Sorry, my cat just pulled out my headphones. We can put them in jail for up to 6 months, or we can serve them a $10,000 fine, or both of those things. And it's really interesting to me because this piece of legislation is really borrowing policy that we see in the United States. And so we have a think tank in Texas called the Cicero Institute. It's run by billionaire Joe Lonsdale, who has been fighting across the US at all different levels of government, state level, municipal level, to enact these bylaws that essentially say that if somebody is living in an encampment, they're a criminal and they should be put into jail for up to 6 months, or fined, in the case of the US, usually about 5,000 USD. So it's actually lower as a fine than we're seeing in Canada. So we've actually transplanted this very right-wing policymaking into Ontario and suggested that the solution to homelessness is criminalizing people, which is absolutely incorrect, as all of us, I think, would agree. One of the remedies as well of Bill 6, which we might actually see more often, is that basically a police officer can remove somebody against their will and put them on the doorstep of any social service agency. that becomes a liability for that agency. What is the expectation here? What are they meant to provide? In most cases, they're not going to be able to provide anything because the actual resources people need, like housing, are simply not within their fingertips to offer in the immediate period. So I really worry about that. And I think part of it is that, social services that are encompassed here can include a heart hub. It can include a drug treatment center. And part of me believes that this is how we start to legislate coercive treatment without actually legislating coercive treatment. And this is why it becomes a companion to Bill 10, because with Bill 10, we're looking at housing specifically, commercial landlords and residential landlords, and then targeting drug trafficking within those spaces. So again, I think this is how we make it impossible for people to exist who use drugs in many different spaces and start to push them toward mandatory drug treatment. So I find it quite insidious for that reason. And I think what we're going to see with Bill 6 is that I think you'll probably see this rolled out sooner than later. It's interesting because municipalities asked for these special tools. These are not municipal tools. What Bill 6 grants are not tools to municipalities. They are tools for police and the courts. Municipalities can't tell the police what to do except enforce bylaws. They can't tell them to enforce provincial law. So it'll be at the discretion of police services across Ontario to actually roll this out. And I think there are some that will probably do this sooner than later. So I think it's just a matter of time before we start seeing it. And social service agencies, again, should be prepared and understand that they will have folks likely dropped off on their doorsteps and expectations that somehow they're going to take care of this person. So it's pretty dark. I'll put it that way.
Wow. To all of you, what practical steps can housing providers or social service agencies, like you said, take right now?
Well, I will kick it off and just simply say that, I think that partnership is critical now more than ever when it comes to legislation like this. This is not solely a mental health issue or a substance use issue or a criminal justice issue. This is where all partners who work in these various sectors need to come together and really ensure that we have a united voice in terms of how this is impacting, what it means on the ground, where there, to Diana's last point, where there are differences across the province in terms of how this is being enforced and what that looks like. And everybody has a stake in this. Anybody who's close to these issues or serves this community has a stake in this, and I think it's really critically important that we work together.
So first of all, I really appreciate the commentary about police rights in Bill 6. It's important. They're actually replicated by and large in Bill 10. It is a pretty remarkable amount of authority that's put in. If you are a commercial landlord, for example, and there is an issue on your site, the police have the jurisdiction under that act to simply shut the site down. And there's nothing, doesn't really say anything else about how that changes or returns to your authority. But to answer your question, Emmy, I think there's room here for advocacy through the nonprofit housing organizations, whether it's ONFA, ONFA in this case, or the co-ops, where we talk specifically about the implications for this on the housing providers themselves. There's an underlying assumption here that this, we're such great guys that we're all going to take care of this, and all this stuff that comes our way that I just described is going to be okay because somehow the nonprofit sector will expand to accommodate. And I don't think that's really true. And I think it's important to be able to say that and why. That is a direct response from important members of the community to local MPs and so on. But there's another piece of advocacy I think is worth stating, and that's it is the common objective right now of the federal government, the provincial government, and any politician who stands up and says to say, I want to solve the housing crisis. Well, that's always not a day over day thing, but you can point out, I think we can point out that this kind of act where you say, okay, hey, members of the board of that land trust, you're now you're not liable for things that are happening in the unit in Chinatown or in York Region that you're not even directly supervising unless you take reasonable measures. Well, you're pulling in the wrong direction. It's hard enough to create additional units, to pull units out of the financialized market, to do the things we need to do to create a strong and robust community housing sector in this province. That to add this on, where we have to explain stuff to directors, potentially come up with set-asides to protect them from liability, to do all that stuff, is not a helpful addition to that mission. So I do think there's room to point out that if the objective is to make an impact, then we're heading. This legislation is pulling against that.
I will always say advocacy is the right move here. I think actually our ally in all of this are municipalities, because as much as we've had certain mayors, suggest that this kind of policymaking is what's needed, look at these fines. Do you know who processes these fines? Municipalities do. They're going to have to process, these $10,000 fines that are being thrown at homeless people. They're going to be processing $1 million fines that are going to be thrown at nonprofit housing corporations. This is going to create an even larger backlog for them. There's going to have to be resources put into processing these different fines that they simply don't have. And if we're also granting all the powers to police, you have to pay for that. And how are you going to pay for that? You got to raise your property taxes. In the case of Bill 10, you can actually, as a housing provider, be liable not just with a fine, but also with the cost of enforcement. So they're offsetting that particular cost by saying, the police came and charged your entire board. Well, we're going to have you pay for that happening as well. But that said, there are the fines that are still attached to that become that are processed in the provincial offense courts. And so that is done by municipalities. They don't want any of this. They don't have to say to their constituents that, we have to raise your property taxes again so that we can do these enforcement measures that don't actually solve the issues that you care about. Community safety, encampments, homelessness more generally. And I think municipalities understand that, the majority of them. So I think, as housing providers, as folks doing this work, even just outreach volunteers, whoever you are, I think this is where we start to partner with our municipal governments and say, this is not going to work for anybody. This is not what anyone actually asked for. Here is a kind of policy that would make sense. So I think we find our allies and we use this other level of government against this upper level of government to say, this is not working. We need to do better. So I in my head, I have this whole giant strategy that I'm working out. But I think that's where we're going to make the change. By kind of leaning into our municipal governments here. So that's kind of my take. So start to pressure your councillor and your mayor.
Awesome. And I think in that vein, like you both have said it now. So, if there is that voice from nonprofit, from ONFA, and, providers, landlords, and like word of mouth starts to spread here, would you share with us what bill updates, because you have all your head around the legal pieces and, like you said, a whole strategy in your head, Diana. What bill updates, changes, or clarifications would you like to see to ensure that this law can advance the work of nonprofits and charities in housing, homelessness, mental health, and the supportive housing context? Can you call out like specific tweaks or changes, or stop the bill or change the bill that you would ask for?
I'm a stop the bill guy. I think you folks might have better insight into this. My understanding of Bill 10 was that it was supposed to also respond to unit takeovers. And there are aspects within Schedule 8 that do that. So if there's a way to massage those that it can make sense, sure. I want to throw out everything else because, again, even with clarity, I don't think it's going to set us up to improve housing quality, to expand housing. I think it's going to make it harder, as Camille, as John have both mentioned. So I think in this case, mostly, we just need to get rid of this stuff.
So I guess if I had to, let's just, for the sake of argument here, say you have to keep a bill. I actually, in my imagination, particularly from an ex-TCHCer's point of view, unit takeovers is what I had in mind, because it was always so painful to be forced. Eventually, the only remedy is the eviction of the tenant who's being taken over. Like and TCHE is big enough. In those days, we were rehousing somewhere else, but it's still painful, right? You're saying, okay, you live at Jane and Finch, now you have to live at in Scarborough. That's people are used to their bank machine. They're used to all kinds of stuff. So it's not; those aren't fun remedies. But that's what I had in mind. So if that's what you were going to go for, then it should be. If there's a trigger, you have to know. You have to be able to actually perform the eviction. It's not fair to say, "Hey, landlord, you have to do something about it," but you can't get to the board on time. Oh, and by the way, you can't take the rent because somebody's going to pay for that. Those are not fair positions to take. So if that was, what I'd like to understand is, instead of this broad language, we're going to hold you accountable for turning a blind eye. Like specifically, what are we talking about? Because we seem to, what's the problem we're actually trying to solve? And maybe just adjust a bit more around that. I want to make one other addition. When I talked about ONFA before, I don't mean to suggest they're not involved. They are directly involved in communication with the ministry now on behalf of housing providers in Ontario. So I know that actually is happening. I would not wish to leave another.
I would. Following on your thinking there, John, I would say very bare minimum would be just leave all forms of supportive housing out of this. That would be a healthy place to start. But I don't disagree with Diana in terms of the legislation.
And just interested in that comment, Camille, does that mean, like for our listeners, because supportive housing is really based around supporting people in their very most a time of vulnerability, I suppose, and maybe a time where you're looking to change things or treatment, etc., that there's also an opportunity for us to focus energies, and I say us as the broader word of sector, but also government, focus energies on preventative or interventive measures for those who are struggling with mental health addictions and so on. Interestingly, I was just having lunch with Rebecca Shields, CEO for York Region CMHA, and she was talking about some really interesting interventions rolling out in the States, like research being done on regenerating brain cells and its work and how it can turn things. Still very early stages, it sounds like, but it would be interesting to see some of our energies channeled into how we can actually change the narrative instead of coming up with, resourcing more problem type of work.
Emmy, I don't think I could have said it better. I think if we have time, effort, energy, and resources, let's look at brain science and other places for sure.
I even think in the very short term, because I'm dealing mostly with the homelessness side of things, this government is throwing up its hands and saying, there's nothing we can do. All we can do is just arrest people. What about the Canada-Ontario housing benefit? Here's a quick thing that we know works. We could put investments into that, and we know that we could move substantial numbers of people out of shelter systems if that were made more available. There are very easy things, solutions that we can enact right now that are somehow they're blind to them, which absolutely boggles my mind. So, I think thinking of things like mental health, addictions, substance use, homelessness as these intractable problems, they're solvable. And I think even just having that framework first and then looking to solutions that are currently working and then looking forward to other solutions that we can enact in the medium and long term is just the way to go. And for some reason, politically, we just can't seem to get there, even when they're right in front of us. So I will say it's not like there's nothing we can't do. One thing we could do is increase the COB. So easy.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about the COB for any listeners who don't know what you're referring to?
Yes, it is a rent supplement program. So it will basically meet the difference between your current income and rent. And so a lot of supportive housing providers, a lot of the housing that's provided is using these rent supplements, but it also works in private market housing as well. In Toronto specifically, it is the only way that we are moving people out of the shelter system. And so we saw a delay in this rent benefit being rolled out from the provincial side. So it's cost shared with the federal government, it's 50-50. And the province, for no reason at all, decided not to actually give out funding last year until October. It was meant to be distributed in April, and they just didn't. And so in Toronto, nobody left the shelter system. We had more and more people out on the streets, out in encampments. And it was just such an easy solve that, again, it boggles my mind that somehow this is not clicking, or it's on purpose, who knows. And yet we have this provincial government saying there's nothing we can do except, send in the police to arrest people and fine them. It's utterly ludicrous. But the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, I'm not in the long term a fan, but in the short term, I think it works really well. And so why are we not putting more investments into it?
How long is that benefit in place for?
It always gets renewed. I feel like the last time I checked, it was for 6 years. It always gets renewed. And I know people will say, oh, this costs a lot of money. Not any more money than putting somebody in jail for a year, which costs well over $100,000. So, you're going to save money as well as have healthier outcomes for people. So, a lot of people, especially for refugees that we're working with, and we have a lot of refugees who are landing in Toronto specifically, it works so well for these folks. And so they transition into employment long before the rent benefit actually ends, which is to say, like, they're not on it and then suddenly they drop out of housing. And yet, again, for some reason, it is just not part of the provincial conversation. Just boggling.
That is the mind-boggling part. The shelter is the more expensive option. Jail is more expensive than that, and hospitalization is either more expensive or in between the two. So if housing is the least expensive option, then the fiscally conservative approach to this should be to support rent subs and the expansion of the housing system. So it does cause you to wonder how much is driven by where the dollar is accounted for in the system. So in all of this, the biggest difference in what Diana just said, and many differences we just said in the Act, but one is who's paying for what. So the Act doesn't actually include any costs that are not in place now on the provincial ledger. It adds costs to volunteers. It adds costs to nonprofits. So it's going to add to their fundraising efforts and so on, and to municipalities. But that's, if you were to take a holistic picture of it, you would say, well, if I'm fiscally conservative and presumably I just don't think people should be exposed to the cold in the bus stop in the middle of the winter and that kind of stuff. As long as I get past that and I'm fiscally conservative, I'm going to be a houser. I'm going to go for housing. It's, that's where you'll end up. But you have to be willing to say, okay, I'm worried about this as a taxpayer, but only, and I don't care which of my tax dollars is paying for that. I just care that you guys get it together and do this as best you can. And the answer is going to be housing.
Is there anything else you would like to share, any of you, that you haven't had a chance to yet? I feel like I could stay on with you all day, but we do have to wrap up soon. So is there anything that's outstanding for the listeners?
I want to mention Bill 25, because there's more. It's not just Bill 10 and it's not just Bill 6, but we have Bill 25 as well, which ostensibly is about emergency management. It comes out of COVID. It's meant to realign how we engage in emergency services across this province. But one of the things that's built into this is that the Minister of Children, Community and Social Services is being given special powers. And these powers allow them to dictate at any time orders to any entity that receives ministry funding. So that could be an agency, that could be a municipality, under the guise of an emergency. And so what are emergencies? Homelessness, the toxic drug crisis. These are emergencies. And I think, again, the thing about all these bills is that there's so little clarity about them that you can imagine many things, but the intention is always a little bit gray area, who really knows. But to be aware that in the future, this could be used as a way to suppress advocacy from nonprofits and even from municipal governments as well. So you dictate to a municipality, for example, you have to, go along with Bill 6, you have to support the eviction of people and putting them into jail. Otherwise, we pull your funding for shelters. That is the kind of power that can be put into Bill 25 that I think people should be aware of, because why would you build something like that into an emergency management bill? You think about it for 2 seconds. Why would that particular minister need those powers? It doesn't actually make any sense. Health minister, sure, that makes sense, but not community and social services. So it has not passed. Be aware that it will come up in October again when the House sits, and start to ask those questions about what is this? Who is this for? What does it intend to do? Because I think broadly speaking, it can be used in very nefarious ways if we don't start asking those questions. So I'll be honest, I'm very political here. This government is trying to take control of many different facets of our society. This includes school boards. This includes municipalities through strong mayor powers. In Toronto, it includes cutting our city council down more than half. And I think in this case, this also allows them to have control over public services as well that are third party. So sorry to bring more bad news, but there is more to be considering as well.
Anyone else have some last minute things to throw in? No, that's great, Diana. Thank you for sharing.
I'm generally, I prefer to stick to the advocacy we talked about before. But I mean, I did want to say one more thing, and that's I'm really glad that you've taken over chairing this podcast. It's been a podcast for years. Diana and I are both repeat guests. In fact, this is our second time on together, and
awesome.
And we're really glad that you're carrying on this great tradition.
Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you, John. Thank you, Camille, for sharing your insights. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for your advocacy in the sector, your support of the sector. We so appreciate your work, your perspectives, and also thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I think this is a really important conversation. Like you said, John, ONFA is doing some important work. I've seen all of you doing important work in the media and sharing the word, which is why we wanted to have you here to share your wealth of expertise on these topics. Thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. For any of the listeners who might want a bit more information or want to hear more or get involved, where can they connect and learn more? Either with yourselves or resources.
Well, for me, you can just look me up online. If you just Google John Fox, you have to Google John Fox lawyer, or you'll get the NFL coach. It will dominate your feedback. But if you put John Fox lawyer, you will be able to find your way to my website and contact information.
Also, Google CMHA Ontario, and our website has a lot of resources.
I'm just a guy who does random stuff. I have formed a coalition of organizations across Ontario. We're just kind of sitting back for a little while now that Bill 6 has passed, but I'm hoping to re-galvanize 114 organizations across Ontario, almost 100 municipal councillors who are saying no to this kind of legislation. So stay tuned. I'm going to start that back up, and I need all the people involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on this show today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for our show today on Bill 6, Bill 10, and Bill 25. Some important insights from John, Diana, and Camille. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, for On the Way Home.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.